All right, so today we have Misty Winston returning to the show. Misty, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Very happy to have you, Misty, especially because you are just one of the best voices and, for Julian Assange, which is why I have you on to talk about Assange today, but also just amplifying the independent media and, people who may not be your closest allies like us at the Libertarian Institute. So I like to have you back on the show, although I have to say, I find this to be maybe the most frustrating topic to talk about at times. And I think it's because I know that the war in Ukraine would not have started, but would have
Yeah.
ended much, much sooner had Julian Assange not been in the Belmarsh prison, had WikiLeaks been functioning at its operational capacity. And I mean, Misty, maybe the war in Gaza doesn't even happen. Maybe WikiLeaks puts out a report in 2021, some, internal Israeli report on, say, the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. And the American people take note of that and they say, hey, this really isn't right that Israel is getting away with not just killing Palestinians, but American Palestinians. And so maybe by the time we get to this point, Israel can't launch a full-scale war in Gaza because they have to they have some conditions on the support they get from the U.S., but that's not the world we live in, unfortunately. And even worse, Misty, it looks like we are moving towards what Julian's wife, Stella Assange, has labeled as Day X, which will be, I guess, Assange's last real appeal in the U.K., and then after that, anytime his potential extradition to the U.S. So catch us up. What's going on here?
Well, first of all, what you just said is absolutely true. And I think also there's a very good chance that they wouldn't have been able to be so effective with the COVID stuff. And listen, I don't know that necessarily WikiLeaks could have stopped the war in Ukraine or could have stopped what's happening in Gaza, but it certainly would have been much more difficult for them to do any of those things. It certainly would be more difficult for them to be gearing up for a war in Taiwan. It would be difficult for them to be, I mean, you and I talk about the stuff that's happening in North and South Korea. All of that stuff would be more difficult if we had a legitimate, free, and functioning press, and if WikiLeaks were fully operational. It's not. And Julian Assange is, as you just mentioned, currently fighting extradition to the United States. So where we currently stand right now, so there was just actually a lot of news just came out just in this past week. So the biggest thing I think is obviously what you just mentioned, Day X, which this is, it sounds, it's kind of cheesy, like it's kind of like a cheesy name or something, but I think it was just intended to grab people's attention. And it's something that the Assange team came up with as a way to just kind of inform people, because in the Assange situation, we never have a deadline. This time we do, which is weird. We actually have like court dates, which is rare. It's very rare that we actually have a scheduled time or date when anything's going to be happening. Usually it's just decisions that are announced whenever they feel like announcing them. And the last decision, it took 8 or 9 months for them to come out with. So we weren't sure when this latest decision on this request for appeal was going to be announced. It was announced this week. So it's kind of convoluted. So I'll try to explain it the best that I can. Essentially what happened in June of last year, the Assange defense team submitted a request for appeal. So in the UK High Court, you have to request for them to hear your appeal. That's the decision that I mentioned that took 8 or 9 months to deny. So they denied the request for the hearing for the appeal. So what happened is that a few months ago, the Assange defense team appealed that decision. So it was kind of an appeal on the appeal, if that makes sense. So that decision has actually come through. It has been granted. He is going to be getting a new hearing 2 days in February 20th and 21st of 2024. And that will be in front of 2 new judges. So that's important. The last guy, it was just one guy, a single judge, who just gave us like this very vague 3-page denial of the appeal. But it will be 2 new judges. That guy will have nothing to do with it, at least on the surface. And that will be taking place in February. So obviously there are going to be events taking place very clearly. If you're in London or anywhere near London, get to the court. Obviously it is a weekday, but you have plenty of time. There's a couple months now that you can request time off or whatever, but they're going to start gathering outside the court at 8:30 a.m. This is, as you mentioned, potentially the last chance. I have my own theories. We can talk about it if you want, but this could potentially be his last chance to avoid extradition to the United States.
Yeah, go ahead and let me know what your theories are and, kind of how things could play out here. Because, anytime we're talking about the judicial system in any country, there's a lot of different pathways things could take. So, and I know in Europe it's a little different because you have this European Court of Appeals that kind of exists as not necessarily something that has sovereign power over the UK government, I guess, but has leverage. And so, yeah, what's the next steps you think?
So this is just my opinion. I mean, and I'm far from the only one who holds this opinion, but it is my belief that they absolutely do not want to extradite Julian Assange to the United States, in particular during an election year. That's not good for them. That is very bad for them. In fact, that is horrible optically. And it doesn't matter who you are. If you're Donald Trump or if you're Joe Biden, it's a bad look. It was under Donald Trump that Julian Assange was arrested. Obviously, Joe Biden is continuing the persecution of a journalist for telling the truth. So that's a bad look for either party. And so I genuinely do not think that they want to actually extradite him to the United States. Now, I could be wrong. They could be really dumb and want to bring him here. I think that opens up multiple cans of worms. It opens up the conversation about why are we targeting a journalist? Why are we prosecuting a journalist? What did he do? People are going to start to look into that. In the United States, they've done a very good job of kind of distracting away from that conversation, distracted away from conversation about this in general. You don't hear anybody, most people don't even know who Julian Assange is. Mainstream media very rarely touches it. Every maybe 5 or 6 months, they'll do a 2-minute piece about how he smears poop on the walls, and that's the best you get from them. So it's very rare to hear any legitimate conversation. So it opens up a conversation about who Julian Assange is, why are we going after him? It also opens up a conversation about, and this is something that they've been desperately trying to avoid, the content of the releases that he is being prosecuted for. And a lot of people are unclear about what he's even being prosecuted for. A lot of people think it has to do with 2016 and with Russiagate and Hillary Clinton and all of that stuff. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the 2010 and 2011 releases of the Guantanamo files, the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs, the collateral murder video. And they don't want those conversations to be had because what he exposed is some of the most horrific war crimes on record, lies that they have been telling us about those wars. And so I think that they're very desperate to avoid those conversations, specifically during an election year. I think they're going to try, and we know that the goal here was always to kind of kick the can down the road as long as humanly possible. And WikiLeaks themselves release that information. If in the Stratfor files, if you go and look at it, there were email conversations taking place where they were discussing how to deal with their Assange problem. And one of the ways that they discussed was, well, we'll just tie him up in legal stuff for 25 years. That's exactly what they're doing. And so I think that the intention here is to try to drag this out even longer, hopefully as long as they can, and for sure at least past the election. But that's just my theory. I mean, I'm open to being wrong. And I think that regardless, the only thing that stops it is mass public pressure. That's really the only thing that gets Julian Assange out of prison.
Yeah, I guess, Misty, my only concern is, we see with the Israel situation now that Biden seems either hemmed in by a small section of his supporters that agree with, this centrist take, this very Hillary Clinton viewpoint of the world. We have to support Israel no matter what. We have to fight Russia and Ukraine no matter what. We have to confront China and Taiwan no matter what. We can't back down to North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and we have to extradite Julian Assange. And so my concern is that, just the way the White House is operating right now, I'm not sure they care about the people who actually care about human rights. We've seen with the Israel policy that no matter how low Joe Biden's approval rating goes, it's at 34% in some of these polls now.
Yeah.
It doesn't really seem to be having a very large impact on the White House policy. I mean, they're hedging their language a little bit, but we've been watching this, absolute obliteration of Gaza for 10 weeks now, over 2 months. And people are mad. White House, there are hundreds of people who work in the Joe Biden administration, not people who work at the State Department their whole lives, but political appointees. The people who got their jobs probably because they were out campaigning for Joe Biden, donating to Joe Biden, are signing letters saying that, we don't want this war. We want a ceasefire. And still, Misty, today, the UN is preventing a UN Security Council vote that would call for a ceasefire. So
yeah. And you
I
may be
guess I
right.
hope so,
Listen,
but
you may be right about that. And frankly, I'm not convinced that Joe Biden's even going to be the nominee. I don't think he's going to be. I think
fair
that they are
enough.
going to try to pull him along as far as they can. And then suddenly it's going to be, oh, Joe Biden is ill. He can't continue. Nancy Pelosi will give a speech and she'll cry and she'll say, go win one for the Gipper. And they're going to install Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or Michelle Obama. You know what I mean? I think that that's very likely. And if that situation arises, I think that most likely how they will handle the Assange situation there is very much how they handled it with Joe Biden is, oh, well, it's in the courts now. There's nothing we can do. That we have to let it play out in the courts. Very much how Obama handled Standing Rock. Oh, it's in the court. We got to let it play out. So yeah, I think that I'm very open to being wrong about this. There's a couple different ways that they could play this situation. I just don't know if they want that level of distraction. And obviously, those conversations about the war crimes that were exposed, I think that they've always been desperate to contain that as best that they can. And especially given right now the foreign policy situation on multiple fronts, those conversations are already being had. And I think adding fuel to that fire may not be something they want to do. But you're right. They really do not care what we think. They do not in any way, shape, form, or fashion care what we stand for, what we are fighting for or against. They don't. Our opinions matter none at all. So you could absolutely be right. They could go ahead and extradite Julian Assange while Joe Biden is still president. And then they could make that switch and it could be a whole lot of confusion and stuff that would kind of overshadow it. So you could certainly be right. There's no question about it.
Okay, Misty. So back to, I guess, more the discussion of Assange, of what's going out on now. You have, this current appeal, and the Assange team seems to be presenting it as kind of his final chance in the UK. So let's say that appeal gets denied. At that point, I guess he could be extradited at any time.
Yeah, I mean, within hours, essentially. I mean, at least as far as I'm understanding it, and I'm no expert on UK law, so I mean, it's a little bit fuzzy to me. There are a couple different legal avenues that he could take, but I think that those are tenuous at best. I think that, as you mentioned, the European Court of Human Rights is a potential option, but the political environment between the UK and the European Court of Human Rights is not all that strong right now. There's a lot of contention there. So I'm not even sure that the UK would acknowledge a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights at this point. That is something that they have discussed in the past, the Assange defense team. Obviously, they aren't really talking strategy out loud in the public for obvious reasons. And I'm not privy to those conversations. I'm not in those rooms hearing those discussions being had. So, but there are a couple other potential legal options. But if this appeal, if he goes to these two court dates in February and the appeal is denied, I mean, he really could be on U.S. shores. I mean, really within hours, if not days, I would imagine.
Yeah, my concern is, Misty, we wouldn't even know he was here until days
He's here.
after, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
That they would try to do this in the middle of the night, either very quickly, I would guess. So like, as you said, in the maybe hours after the appeal or whatever final thing needs to happen in the UK, or a couple weeks, they'll do it on a Friday of a holiday like Easter weekend or something and ship them off to the US, and nobody in the US will even know about it till Wednesday or Thursday. And it's, kind of not too late, but too late to really start, protest what when you should be protesting, I think.
Yeah, we
Um,
should be protesting the minute he gets here, and I think that they're going to try to avoid that. That's what Day X was created for. Which, by the way, Day X is something you can actually sign up for if you want to get either an email or text alert. You can go to the website and you can either enter in your email or your phone number. They won't spam you or anything. It'll just be, hey, things are happening. We need to go. You know what I mean? So definitely, if people are interested in that, sign up for that.
So what other activism is going on, Misty? I know I saw you tweet about the Rage Against the War Machine rally, and that, of course, that will be coming up, I think, in the beginning of February, so before the Day Ads event. And
I think it's
then,
just a few days before.
okay. And
I think.
the number one thing on their list is pardon Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and all whistleblowers. And so, Assange is a journalist, not necessarily a whistleblower, but, kind of same principle applies here, and good to see this. So, Other than Rage Against the War Machine, where are some places that people could go out and start to, made some noise about this? My friend and friend of the show, Kelly Lane, told me that there's an event going on January 20th, candidates for Assange. I think they're trying to push, people running for office to go ahead and adopt a free Assange stance. So that seems like a good thing. Lots going on here. So
Yes.
Misty, what are some things you're aware about?
There are a ton of things happening right now. So, and first of all, thank you to the Rage Against the War Machine people. Initially, when they put out the website for this event, last time Assange was already on there. This time, when they put the website up, the Assange and whistleblower thing wasn't included. So I reached out to Angela McArdle. She was very receptive. Apparently, it was just an error on whoever created the website, and they were quick to fix it and added Assange and whistleblowers as their number one request. So I appreciate them moving quickly on that and for including Assange and whistleblowers. I think that's key to what their whole agenda is. So I appreciate that. But yeah, there's a ton of stuff happening. So there are a ton of events that are scheduled on or around December 22nd. I always tell people, my friend Alex Hills runs the page Candles for Assange. It's the number 4. It's on Twitter. I think she's also on Facebook, although I'm not on Facebook. And I know that at one point she was suspended from Facebook, so I'm not sure if she's back on Facebook or not. I need to ask her. But if you want to just go and look, you can. But she's certainly on Twitter. I'm looking at her page right now. But Alex does a fantastic job of kind of collecting all of the global events and consolidating them and then posting them from one central location. So she's got a thread here. It's a running thread, and there are events taking place all over the world. There's one on the 22nd in London. There's one on Sunday, December 17th in Washington, D.C. There's one in Adelaide. There's one in Vienna. There's one in Wellington. There's one in Tulsa. There's one in Dublin. I mean, there are cities all across the globe who are doing stuff on a regular basis. Many of these cities, like the German groups, there's multiple German groups. I think they do something weekly. Boston does something bi-weekly. I think Washington, D.C. goes to, oh my God, why am I blanking on his name? Merrick Garland's house twice a month, I think bi-weekly. So there's stuff happening all the time. So if you're interested in getting involved in an event like that, I would certainly recommend following Alex at Candles for Assange. She's constantly tweeting out those events as they're happening. I know that there's also some talk about a potential New Year's Eve type of a situation. I don't have any solid information on that just yet. I think they're still trying to get that put together in a way that they can publish it. But there's also a couple different things happening legislatively. There is a bipartisan bill that it's crazy that first of all, there was the letter that was signed, which is incredibly bipartisan. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are signed onto the same letter, which if you would have told me that would happen, I would have laughed. But there you have it. But there's also House Resolution 934, which is fairly recent. I think it came out maybe like a week ago-ish. I don't know. My concept of time is very off. But it's also a bipartisan bill. So if you can make phone calls to your elected representatives, encourage them to sign on to that. There was a major push over the summer where we had members of Australian Parliament who visited the United States and had meetings with American lawmakers. That was all very productive. That is what really prompted the initial Thomas Massey bill that came out and the letter and all of that stuff. And that is now continuing to snowball. So there's been a huge shift in momentum since that Australian visit here to the United States. I think that was incredibly productive. And listen, I'm not one who puts a whole lot of stock in making phone calls or contacting our elected representatives because, like we mentioned earlier, they don't care what we think. But I do think, as I said, in my opinion, the way that we get anything of substance is through mass public pressure. And if enough people are loud about this, if we make it politically untenable for them to continue, I think that's the only way that we stand a chance here. So definitely attend an event if you can. A big thing is sharing information. Algorithmically, Assange stuff is impossible. It is impossible. I have been, what's it called? Search suggestion banned for ages. Like you can't look me up on Twitter unless you know my entire handle. It doesn't just come up in the Dropbox. That's been happening for some time. And this is post Elon Musk takeover. It's still happening. Assange supporters are often suspended or banned or shadow banned. All of that stuff is happening on a regular basis. Assange posts are often visibility limited. So helping us get information out is hugely beneficial, especially when it comes to promoting these types of events, promoting House Resolution 934, promoting any of the stuff that's taking place around this case, because it is so difficult to get through the algorithm, and most people have no clue what's happening to Julian Assange, and further how what's happening to him impacts all of us. Yeah, I think that that's a big thing. Obviously, February, there's going to be events taking place all over the globe, in particular in London. So if you're in Europe or anywhere near London, if you can get to London, we need as many people to show up there as humanly possible to really make a statement. So, but there will be events taking place all over the globe. Certainly there will be one in Washington, D.C., Boston, Tulsa, Seattle. There's always stuff taking place. Chicago, likely. There's always stuff taking place in multiple different locations, and especially on these big days. So I would just, those are the key things that I would say. Making those phone calls, as much as I don't know that they're all that beneficial, they only take literally like 2 minutes. Most likely you're going to get an answering service of some kind. You're going to leave a message. It takes 2 minutes. Every once in a while, you'll get an actual human being, some intern or whatever, who will take your message and write down a note. It still takes 2 to 3 minutes. It's not that difficult. So it's something that everybody can do. Sending emails, tweeting, having conversations with friends and family, hanging up flyers in your neighborhood, just informing people about what's going on. All of that stuff is super helpful. But really just, attending events, sharing the information, making as much noise as we can, educating yourself about what's going on, how it impacts you, and then sharing that information with others is all, just basically the stuff I would suggest.
Yeah, especially if you get a hold of a staffer or intern or
Yeah,
something, because then they're going to relay your concern. And some of these people may not know about Julian Assange.
I've had
We
that.
do not send our best and our brightest to Washington, D.C. So there's a real chance here that like you could really educate like a staffer or something on this issue. And that can have some, sway in that, congressman, congresswoman's office. Now, I guess if you're in New York and you're stuck like calling Chuck Schumer, yeah, you're probably not going
Right.
to move him. But there are a lot of representatives that probably don't have very entrenched positions on Julian Assange and would just vote with the caucus if they're not pushed to, take another position otherwise. So there probably is some room to move there. Now,
Yeah.
let's talk about this really important story. Our mutual friend Kevin Gostola with The Dissenter had a very nice write-up on the whole thing that I suggest people go and read. But can you give us a short summary on some good news? It looks like Mike Pompeo can be
Yeah.
sued.
Yeah, it's great, right? So first of all, shout out to Kevin Gostola. If you are interested in learning more about the Assange case, he is your guy. There are multiple journalists who are covering this and who do fantastic coverage of it. John Pilger, Chris Hedges, Craig Murray, Randy Credico, tons of people who do great work. But Kevin Gostola has really been covering this since the Chelsea Manning stuff. Before Assange was, like from day one. So he is a fantastic source, and he has a book out, by the way. Also, Stefan, I always recommend, if you're interested in learning anything about the Assange case, I call it the Holy Trinity. It's Professor Nils Melzer's book. He's the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. Stefania Marizzi's book, who is an Italian journalist who's been in a 5 or 6 year FOIA battle with 5 different countries trying to get information about the behind the scenes of the Assange case. And then Kevin Gostola's book. Those are all 3 must reads, absolutely incredible. And they all come at the case from very different perspectives. So you learn a little bit something new from each of those books. But sorry, a little aside there. But yes, Kevin did a great write-up and has done great coverage of this for a very long time. But for those who don't know, what this is really centered around is there is a Spanish security firm called UC Global, who was initially hired by the Ecuadorian government to provide security to the Ecuadorian embassy in London. They were very quickly co-opted by the CIA and essentially turned into a spying operation. And I realize all of this sounds like a very bad spy movie. It's real. This really happened. It's crazy. But UC Global was turned into a spying operation on Julian Assange. And by spying on Julian Assange, they also spied on literally every single one of his visitors. That includes conversations with his legal team. That includes conversations with his doctors, his family, journalists, you name it. Anybody who came to visit him was also spied on. And we're not talking about obviously they did have listening devices hidden in fire extinguishers and in the women's bathroom and all of that stuff. But also having their electronic devices taken and cloned, having their paperwork copied, their IDs copied, photographs and videos taken, all of that stuff. The worst of the worst that you can imagine. So there are currently in August of 22, there were 4 Americans who are now suing the CIA and Mike Pompeo, who was then director of the CIA and was kind of overseeing this operation. So these are people who are very kind of close in with the Assange situation. Margaret Kunstler, who's a civil rights activist and human rights attorney. She's been heavily involved for many years. Deborah Herbeck, who's a media lawyer who represented Assange, and WikiLeaks journalist John Getz, who worked for Der Spiegel, which is there were the big 5 media organizations that collaborated with WikiLeaks on the 2010-2011 publications, and journalist Charles Glass, who wrote articles on Assange for The Intercept. So those 4 American citizens are suing the CIA and Mike Pompeo for essentially a breach of their Fourth Amendment rights. So initially, the United States government attempted to claim that American citizens have no expectation of Fourth Amendment rights on foreign soil. All of that has been dismissed, and the case has now been given the go-ahead to continue. So these 4 American, and kudos to them for having the courage to do this. That's taken on a monster of a beast. But that lawsuit is now able to continue. And so it's going to move ahead. I'm not sure if we have any specific court dates upcoming. But yeah, the CIA and Mike Pompeo are being sued by 4 American citizens for a breach of their rights, which is fantastic.
And you talk about bravery there, Misty.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Chuck Schumer, who warned President Donald Trump about taking on the CIA. These are just, regular citizens. I guess, they are journalists connected to mainstream outlets. And so that does give you a little bit of extra protection
Not much.
But not much. You're right. All right, Misty, before we wrap up here, I know you are a resident of the state of Ohio, and, there's a pretty serious environmental catastrophe that happened there. And after the first couple of weeks, we haven't heard much more about it. So do you have any updates? And maybe your updates are there's not many updates, but what is going on in East Palestine, Ohio?
So you're right. There are updates, but it's nothing good. It is horrendous what's happening there. For those who maybe don't know, which I don't know how you would not know, it was a huge story there for, as you mentioned, a couple weeks. There was a massive train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, hazardous chemicals everywhere. Nobody is really sure exactly what those chemicals were, exactly how they're going to impact the citizens of that community. I'm about 180 miles west of East Palestine. But the updates really are just that Norfolk Southern is very desperately trying to skirt their Norfolk Southern is the train company, the rail company responsible for the derailment. They're very desperately trying to skirt around their responsibilities. They are currently looking to, they were paying for people who wish to relocate to another location, whether staying in hotels or whatever. They had like a fund for that. They are ending that. So people are now going to be forced to go back to their very contaminated homes. They're offering basically pennies on the dollar to anybody who wants to sell their houses, which is ridiculous. It's offensive. There still isn't legitimate testing being done. People still have no idea exactly what they've been exposed to. People are still experiencing very severe symptoms, everything from headaches to nosebleeds to nausea to skin lesions to you name it. There's a whole host of things that people are dealing with. And that's just, we aren't even a year in. It happened in February. So we're about 10 months into this thing. And so we have no idea the long-term impacts of this kind of stuff. And people's houses are contaminated. The air is contaminated. They're now, in fact, transferring, which is insane to me, but they're transferring contaminated water and soil to other locations. I think that they have taken Some of that stuff, there's been some transfer to Michigan, Texas, I think, West Virginia, other locations in Ohio. I know that Coshocton was stuck. With some of the contaminated water, they want to inject it into the ground. And they're really being given no choice on that matter. It's just, hey, we're going to bring all of this stuff to your area, and we're just going to dump it in, whatever. And these are locations that don't really have the capacity or the ability to deal with these types of chemical. We're talking about things like vinyl chloride, all kinds of dioxins, all kinds of really terrible stuff. So Norfolk Southern is trying to get around any responsibility, any financial responsibility. The cleanup has been horrendous. The people aren't being listened to. They're not getting any real clear answers. It's a cover up. I mean, let's just be clear. There is a very obvious and clear cover up taking place about this whole situation. And these are not wealthy people. East Palestine, Ohio is a very poor area. And also we should mention that the place that are taking in the soil and water very conveniently, also poor areas. Coshocton, Ohio, Appalachia. These are people who it's difficult for them to fight back against a multi-billion-dollar company like Norfolk Southern. So, and also these communities, the local governments of these communities are making money from doing these types of things. So it's horrendous. These people aren't, and as you mentioned, nobody's talking about it anymore. Most people have forgotten about East Palestine. There's a lot happening in the world, which I understand. I get it. It's difficult to follow everything. But the people of East Palestine have really been up against this on their own. Nobody's listening to them. That's really about all there is to say. It's really horrendous watching what's happening to them. It's really depressing watching the way that this massive massive rail company is just able to, no pun intended, but kind of pun intended, steamroll over these people.
Right. Well, and one, I guess the frustrating things from my perspective, really, Misty, is that, it seems like the Biden administration has endless sympathy and the deepest of pockets for Ukraine or Israel or Taiwan. But when it comes to Americans, then suddenly we have budgetary concerns and things like that.
Right.
And look, as a libertarian, I'm not like a giant social safety net kind of person. But if the government does make promises to you and then something happens, they should, to some respect, try to fulfill those promises. And in this case, in Ohio, particularly, I'm thinking of Hawaii, where, the people were devastated by the fire and really got nothing from the government. But here in Ohio, Norfolk Southern isn't necessarily like a real private company in the way that a libertarian would view a private company. This is a company that has a significant amount of influence in Washington, probably far more than, any community, any of these towns that they're trying to dump the waste in and things like that. And so, it's really disappointing that the government isn't going to act as a fair arbiter here, because if you did have a real judicial system, Norfolk Southern would probably be paying very, very heavily for what happened here. And that has a couple of consequences. And probably number one, Misty, is every other like railway company looks at, what they're transporting, how they're transporting it, where they're transporting it. And they either have to start to upgrade the infrastructure so they could safely transport these chemicals, or they're going to have to, transport them in other areas that aren't as populated or something like that, And so that's how you could reach a better solution here. But you're going to have the government protect the companies. I know the Biden administration has pretty deep ties with the railway companies just from the railway strike situation. I became familiar with that. So my guess is that they're going to get away with paying as little as absolutely possible.
And there's been no action to prevent anything like this from happening again. There's been no examination of why it happened. We've seen the rail companies, and that's why the rail strike happened in the first place, that they've been trying to minimize staffing. We've got like one or two guys running these massive trains. They're overworked. They're not getting time off. They're exhausted. The working conditions are incredibly dangerous. And there's been no conversation about how do we prevent this from happening again. And there's, like 1,000 train derailments on average every single year. And we're going to see another East Palestine, Ohio. That is going to happen. And it's very frustrating to me that, in all of this conversation, and yes, Norfolk Southern should absolutely be held responsible. They should be paying to clean up their mess. They should be paying, if people want to leave their houses, they should be forced to pay for their houses and then some. Medical bills should be paid for, all of that stuff. I mean, this is very clearly their fault. But it's the idea that we're not even having a discussion about how do we make sure this doesn't happen to another community is very frustrating to me.
Yep. And all around, yeah, just horrible. And it really does feel like we live in a crumbling empire, Misty, when you have things like this happen. And and then you see the government response to, again, what's happening at times literally on the other side of the world compared to what's happening within the United States. And it's just, you want to throw your hands up in absolute frustration. Well, Misty, thank you so much for returning to the show. Hopefully next time we'll have some good news about Assange to talk about. I would
love that.
I don't know if that's going to be the case, but I really do hope so. And if not, we will have to talk sometime after the beginning of the year about, it seems like we're gonna have a lot of activism going on in February. Maybe we'll end up at an event together somewhere and be able to hang out in person and talk in person too.
I would love that. And
great to see you again, Misty. Great to talk about you.
Yeah.
And we will do this again soon.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.
Oh, everybody, you are Sarcasm Stardust on Twitter. That's your Twitter handle. And you just hit 100,000 followers, which is pretty cool.
I did.
So
yeah,
congratulations
weird,
on that.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, Misty.
Thanks. Appreciate it.